Greetings, one and all. Welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. Hi, I'm Heavy D. I'm going to tell you a story. How are you doing? Okay, so we're going to read Mark. I think we're on chapter 6. Is that right? Somebody tell me if we're not on 6, but I'll probably recognize it. 1 second. Get it open. Okay, yes, we're on chapter 6. And I've got my text messages are okay. Yay. All right. So we're going to read Mark chapter 6. This is the English Standard Version, and it's kind of long, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, even though there's nobody here. Oh, hi, one person. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today. I get a little lonely when I'm all by myself. So my text message is blowing up. Of course, right when oh, it's because everybody's sending attachments. Okay, super. Yay, okay, here we go. This is Mark chapter 6. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible, and I hope that you have your Bible and you can follow along. Hi, Mom. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Becca. All right. He went away from there, I'm assuming that's Jesus, went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this carpenter the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, "Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, "John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." But others said, he is Elijah. And others said, "He is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for the nobles and his military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them, he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him. I'm like seeing things. Maybe I'm going nuts. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" He said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, "5, and 2 fish." Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him, and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplace and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. That's the end of chapter 6. We will read chapter 7 tomorrow. Mark is an excellent book. Highly recommend it. Oh, miss you. That's a sad face. I'll put more sad face with it. Okay, so does anybody remember what happened in the bronze bow yesterday? So there was a group of slavers, I guess, at the bottom of the hill or whatever, and Rosh and his men kind of ambushed them, and they captured this big old burly black dude that they called Samson, and he doesn't talk, but he's super strong. So that's basically it, right? Okay, so this is chapter 3. I didn't do that right. Chapter 3. I'm not doing very well. Okay, yeah, all right, we'll just keep going. Under the midday sun, the rock would blister one's fingers. The air over the smelting oven quivered. When Daniel Penn, I'm having a real hard time reading today. Let me start over and see if I can do a little better. How about that? Okay, so I've got just, there we go. All right. Chapter 3. Is that better? Okay. Under the midday sun. Howdy. Howdy. So we have successfully started chapter 3 about 4 times now. And just when I finally was able to start, we had a blackout. So I don't know what happened. All the lights went out except for the computer screen. And then the internet obviously didn't have power either because probably the router was also, I don't know where the router is exactly, but obviously not in this room. So anyway, yay. All right. So, all right. So here we go. Chapter 3. Hey, I actually did it right that time. So that was okay. So is Rebecca going to join us again? Is she coming? She coming? She coming? I think maybe she's here. I see a second person. Okay, I'll just go ahead and get started. Chapter 3. Under the midday sun, the rock would blister one's fingers. The air over the smelting oven quivered. When Daniel bent over it to poke at the doughy mass of red-hot ore, the fumes scorched his nostrils. He glanced at Samson, who for a full half-day had been kneading the bellows without ceasing. Perhaps Samson, wherever he had lived, had learned early to endure the heat of the sun. Daniel had had enough for this day. The small lump of iron could be left now till it had cooled enough to be broken into pieces. He picked up a goat-skin bag, tipped it up, and let the warm water run down his throat and splash over his chin and chest. Then he handed the bag to Samson. After almost 4 weeks in the camp, Samson still never helped himself to anything. Daniel had to have it forever on his mind, that the man might be hungry or thirsty. Now, watching the water sloshing out carelessly, he reminded himself that the man had earned it. They had twice as much water in the camp now that Samson helped to haul it from the spring. Had the big man any idea that he was free? He seldom made a move without an order from Daniel. Rosh had given him up in disgust. Rosh was used to seeing men jump when he gave an order, but no matter how he shouted and cursed at Samson, the giant stood immovable, baffled, not sure whether Samson was utterly stupid or only defiant. Rosh had shrugged the man off on Daniel. All day long the giant was at the boy's heels, and all night he slept so close that Daniel could barely stretch his legs without kicking him. It was like being chained to a huge rock, having to drag it with him wherever he went. Daniel had to admit that his work was easier. There was never a lack of firewood, and with Samson to help him with the bellows, instead of the skinny 12-year-old Joktan, he could help a steady heat in the furnace. He could keep a steady heat in the furnace. The other men were grateful for Samson's muscles too. They came to Daniel as though they were asking to borrow a hammer or an axe. A Yes, this guy, something, 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 sacked out. JJ's already asleep. I barely even started. Alrighty. I think JJ will like this story, actually. You guys should listen to this one for your literature class. Be good. Where did I stop? Daniel had to admit work was easier, bolder. They had come to Daniel as though they were asking to borrow a hammer or an axe. A boulder that 5 of them were heaving and tugging, Samson could roll into place like a child's pebble. The whole eastern end of the camp had been fortified in the last 2 weeks. Even Rosh had to admit that Samson earned his keep, but the men still hated and feared him and made him the butt of all their jokes. That was one more reason for Daniel to resent his burden. He felt more than ever shut out from the rest, for the jibes that were aimed at Samson usually included him as well. Was Samson actually deaf? Sometimes he suspected the man understood a great deal more than they realized, and once he had made the mistake of saying so. The only result had been that the men had plagued Samson cruelly, devising all sorts of tests to trick him. They had finally tired of trying to surprise a reaction out of Samson, but they had not convinced Daniel. Was Samson dumb? Dumb, by the way, doesn't mean stupid, it means unable to talk. Were the sounds he occasionally made just gibberish, or were they fragments of a language it was useless to speak? Where had he come from? What thoughts went on behind that impassive face? What memories were locked inside where they could never be shared? At times, Daniel hated him with a dull resentment. At other times, like now, as Samson set down the water skin, wiped a huge hand across his mouth, and looked at Daniel with a slow, childish grin spreading across his face, Daniel felt a grudging liking. He helped himself and Samson from the stock of raw vegetables in the cave, cabbage and cucumbers and onions pilfered from the farms in the valley, and they lay down in the dark shade of the cave to doze away the midday hours. He was roused by Rosh's voice shouting his name. He came out of the cave, still half asleep, blinking in the sunlight. Abel, the sentry, had come into camp, leading a man who was tied and blindfolded, as Rosh ordered all strangers and prisoners must be. Come out here, Daniel, Rosh barked. This fellow claims he was looking for you. Ever seen him before? Daniel came nearer, staring at the young, dark-bearded stranger, unhampered by blindfold or thongs. The man stood in the center of the suspicious ring of outlaws with the easy confidence of one who had nothing to hide. Is this Daniel? He spoke in a deep voice. Peace be with you, my friend. It's been a long time. Daniel came closer. Simon? He asked uncertainly. He could scarcely associate his memory of a tattered apprentice with his small, vigorous man. Joel gave you my message? I was glad to get it. You'd be surprised how often I wondered what happened to you. So you know him? Rosh was puzzled, but he signaled for the man to be released. The boy's been well taken care of, he said affably. You can't deny that. The blindfold removed, Simon looked Daniel over with a twinkle of amusement that the boy was taller than he. He's grown, that's certain, he allowed. I wouldn't have expected so much muscle. That's from the forge, said Daniel, flattered. Did Joel tell you I've kept up my trade? I'll show you. Later, said Simon. First I'd like some water, if you have some. You people give a man a warm welcome up here. Chagrined, Daniel hastened to find the coolest water in the back of the cave. Rosh left them, and the other men made a show of some business well within earshot. Daniel was clumsy with pleasure and importance. Never before had anything like this happened to him. How did you know where to find me? He asked. I had an idea that once I got up the mountain, I'd have plenty of assistance. You might have got hurt instead. I don't think so, said Simon. He seemed very sure of himself. Proudly, Daniel showed Simon his forge. He knew he had reason to be proud of it, but it was gratifying to see Simon's surprise. He had discovered, in his first year on the mountain, patches where the soil was rusty with iron. Gradually, he had learned to smelt it, constructing an oven against a rocky wall, lining it with clay, and devising a primitive sort of bellows from a pair of goat skins. This is very good, said Simon, poking at the lump of ore that lay cooling in the ashes. No wonder you have muscles. Samson helps me, said Daniel, pointing toward the big man who crouched near the mouth of the cave. Simon started. Beard of Moses! Where did you get that giant? He escaped from a caravan, said Daniel. We don't know where he came from. Hmm. With a long look at Samson, Simon turned back to the blade Daniel had put in his hand, running an expert finger along its edge. Not bad, not bad at all. Amalek taught you well. Do you make anything besides daggers and swords? Daniel hesitated. Hooks, sometimes. We don't have horses, and we're not farmers. I see. Simon sat down on the flat stone, his back to the curious eyes. Are you happy here, Daniel? Rosh is good to me, Daniel answered. Nothing like old Amalek. You always wanted to fight the Romans, didn't you? So did you, said Daniel. Joel told me you are called Simon the Zealot. You ought to know Rosh. If you knew him, you'd join him too. A sudden hope sprang up in him. Is that why you came today? Simon shook his head. I've known about Rosh for a long time, he said. I'm a zealot, yes. Rosh and I work for the same end, but we don't exactly see eye to eye. If you really knew him, perhaps. Today I only came to find you. Amalek died a fortnight ago, Daniel. You could come back to the village if you like. Old Amalek dead. Should he feel something? Pleasure, remorse, pity? It was too far away. He had not thought about going back for a long, long time. What about my bond? He asked. I had 4 more years to go. There's no one to hold you to it. He hadn't a relative to his name, nor a friend either, poor man. I doubt anyone would even remember. Daniel tried to imagine going back. He couldn't tell whether he would like it or not. Simon let him think for a moment. Don't you want to see your grandmother again? And your sister? Daniel did not answer. He was ashamed to say that he did not want to see them, but it was true. They have worried about you just as I have, said Simon. If you go back with me, you need stay only a day or two, just to tell them, just to let them see you are well. It would please them. Rosh might need me. Daniel felt upset and resentful, and as he had that day on the mountain top with Joel, what was there in the village for him but the old troubles that had ceased to bother him up here? In the end, however, he let Simon persuade him, Simon and his own curiosity. Rosh grumbled, but there was an irresistible confidence about Simon that Rosh admired. That difficulty came from the one Daniel had not reckoned with at all. As he and Simon walked to the edge of the clearing, a vast shape rose from the mouth of the cave and moved after them. Looking back, Daniel found Samson at his heels. Go back, Samson, he ordered. I go alone this time. He called Joktan, and the red-haired boy jumped to answer. See that he gets his meals, he told the boy. Joktan shut his lips tight, looking stubborn and scared. He won't touch you, Daniel urged. Just for one day, Jock. I'll do your work for you when I get back. Joktan agreed sullenly. Anyone who tries any tricks will have me to reckon with, Daniel shot back over his shoulder. But when he and Simon started forward again, the big man moved behind them. No, shouted Daniel, angry now. He waved his arms. The man stared at him without expression, or was there an expression that Daniel did not want to see? You cannot follow me, the boy said. Wait, I'll be back. Then he turned and stamped down the trail behind Simon. At the first turn, he looked back. Samson stood at the top of the trail looking down. He did not move, and Daniel raised a hand briefly to him and went on. As they walked, Daniel tried again to persuade Simon. If you're a zealot, if you work for the same end as Rosh, why won't you join him? When the day comes, said Simon, when the one comes who will lead us, when we will all join together, then we will all join together. In the meantime, as I said before, Rosh and I don't see eye to eye. For one thing, I prefer to earn my own bread and meat. The insult to Rosh was like a blow to Daniel. Doesn't a warrior earn his keep? He demanded hotly. Rosh would give his life for Israel. Why should the farmers begrudge him a few scraps? They owe him far more than he takes. Perhaps so, said Simon mildly. I did not mean to anger you, my friend. There will be need for warriors, but just now there is always a need for a good blacksmith. Daniel subsided into scowling silence. They left the rocky trail and came out on the road through the green pasture land that sloped down to the village. Presently they reached a small ford that crossed the mountain stream, which gathered in a pebbly hollow richly overgrown with fern and clusters of rosy oleander and purple iris. Simon stopped and studied the spot. This will I do, I think, he said. This will I do, I think he said. What? He began to remove his head covering. Daniel watched, puzzled. We will have to bathe here, said Simon. When we reach the village, it will be too late. Too late? It will be sundown, and the Sabbath will have begun. Daniel reddened. How could he have kept track of the Sabbath? Had Simon guessed that in the cave one day was Had Simon guessed that in the cave one day was the same as another? Simon, not looking at him, was carefully unfolding or folding his cloak and spreading it on a bush. To Daniel's eyes, Simon had no need to bathe. Daniel looked down at his own arms, streaked with soot and sweat. If Simon had said another word or even looked up, he would have abandoned the whole visit. But after a moment he stamped into the fern, stripped off his own filthy tunic, and splashed into the pool. The feel of the water after weeks of measuring it by drops from a goatskin bag was sharp pleasure. Excuse me. Daniel scooped up handfuls of sand and pebbles and scraped his hands and feet. Then he got down on his knees and plunged his whole head into the stream. He came up dripping to find Simon already dressed, sitting on the bank and smiling at him. This time he managed a sheepish grin in return. They reached the village just as the thin, clear note of the ram's horn sounded the first call to the Sabbath, signaling the workers to leave the fields. Nothing had really changed in 5 years, except that it all looked much smaller than Daniel had remembered, the streets narrower and dirtier, the dooryard shabbier and more cluttered. There were a few new houses with fresh mud walls and thatch still green on the roofs. He tried to recall who lived in this house or that one. They passed the shop of Amalek, so crumbling and out of repair that no new occupant had attempted to restore it to use. They passed the deserted square and the well where 4 weary donkeys were being hastily watered. They entered a dark, narrow street, at the end of which stood the small, remembered house, its clay walls dark and crumbling, its roof sagging. Here Simon halted. I will leave you, he said. You will do better to go in by yourself. Daniel looked at the house uneasily. How do I know they are expecting you? I told them you were coming. Daniel glared at him. What right had Simon to be so sure he would come? Simon smiled a brief encouragement and strode away. Daniel stood resentful, overcome with panic, and as he hesitated, the door opened and a very old woman stood on the threshold. How bent she was and thin. Daniel? Could that quavering voice belong to his grandmother? Is that you, Daniel? Yes, grandmother, he stammered. Peace be with you. As he spoke, he heard the second call of the horn across the village. My boy, it is time you came home. Her eyes, pale and clouded, peered up into his face. Her hands clutched at him. At the door, he hesitated, and the strong habit of his childhood reaching out to him. Scarcely aware of what he did, he touched his finger to the mezuzah, the little niche in the door frame that contained the sacred verses of the Shema. Then he stepped over the threshold. The room seemed to be empty. One smoking oil lamp hung from the rafters. On the mat beneath it, the supper dishes were set and the Sabbath lamp stood ready. He peered about him. He peered about him with dread. "Come, Leia," his grandmother said. "You should be working. You should not be working after the second call. Come and greet your brother." Then he saw the girl, seated behind the loom in the corner, the long golden hair flowing over her shoulders. He stood tongue-tied. He had remembered a little girl. She was almost a woman, and he realized that she was beautiful. "Leia," his grandmother fussed again, "it is Daniel, come home after all these years." He ran his tongue over his lips. "Peace, Leia," he said. The girl raised her head from her work so that he caught a glimpse of the clear blue of her eyes. The fear in them struck like a sickness behind his ribs. "Don't mind her," the old woman said. "She will know you before long. Shame, Leia. Get some water for your brother. Where are your manners?" The girl did not move. Daniel waited, sick at heart. "Leia," he stammered, "don't you know me?" He pleaded with her. "Don't you remember how you always brought me water when I came home to visit?" She raised her head again. Slowly into the blue eyes he watched recognition come. "You really are Daniel?" Her voice was faint and tremulous. "You have been away so long. Please, bring me the water, Leia." Obediently she moved from the loom to the earthen jar by the door and poured out water into a hollow bowl, every motion gentle and graceful. But the bowl she held out to him was shaking so that the water spilled over. He took it awkwardly and bent to wash his feet. What had he expected or hoped? It was just as it had been when he left 5 years ago. No, it was worse. His sister Leia was 15 years old, and fear still looked out of her eyes. The last call of the horn came clearly, announcing the start of the Sabbath. His grandmother lighted a wick from the lamp and held it to the Sabbath lamp. "Speak the blessing, Daniel," she said. "It is fitting the man should say it." He hesitated, then the words came falteringly to his lips. "Praise be thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who hast sanctified us by thy commandments and commanded us to kindle the Sabbath light." They sat on the hard dirt floor around the frayed mat, and once again his grandmother looked to him. Long ago, for the first months in the cave, he had repeated a blessing silently over his food. This he remembered well. "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who bringeth forth bread from the earth." This was certainly little to bless God for, a watery stew made of lentils, some coarse barley bread. In a moment he noticed that others were not eating at all, only watching him. The others were not eating at all, only watching him, their eyes following each morsel from the bowl to his mouth. "Do you not eat with me?" "We have eaten already," said his grandmother. But Leia was more honest. "Grandmother said we must save it for you," she explained in her sweet childish voice. "She said you would be very hungry." His appetite left him. "You must eat with me," he insisted, pushing the bowl toward his sister. With a frightened look toward the grandmother, the girl broke off a crust of bread and dipped it into the bowl. He saw the blue veins through the delicate flesh of her hand. The wrist was fragile as a bird's claw. Where did they get their food anyway? He tried to think how to ask. "It is good bread," he said. "Do you grow the grain?" "It is Popper's share," his grandmother answered shortly. He wished he had not asked. He hated the picture of his grandmother following after the reapers in the field, scrabbling for the sheaves they dropped, which had by law to be left for paupers to gather. After the meal was cleared away, they sat in silence. His grandmother did not ask any questions. Did she really care that he had come? She seemed too weary to care about anything. Her chin had settled into the folds of her mantle, and she drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep. He supposed she must still work in the fields of Ketsa, the plant from which the village took its name. Stooping over all day, she sowed and weeded, and when the blue flowers had dropped, the beat off the seed covering with a staff and gathered the tiny seeds so hot to the tongue, which were marketed as a seasoning for food. He looked about him. The clay platform, which had once divided the room into two levels, had crumbled so that it was no more than a shelf, scarcely wide enough for sleeping. A hollow scooped out of the earthen floor held the cold ashes of an old fire. The only furniture was a battered wooden chest and the loom at which Leah had sat. Excuse me. As darkness fell, there was a soft thudding sound against the door. His grandmother roused herself and let in a small black goat. The little creature went straight to Leah, who reached out both arms toward it. The goat nuzzled against her and settled down to sleep with its square chin in the girl's lap. She sat fondling it, twining the black hairs of its beard around her fingers, talking to it in a soft murmur like the sound of doves on the roof. Daniel watched them, his uneasiness lulled for a moment. She looks like our mother, he thought. Then he caught the words the soft voice was saying. You mustn't be afraid of him. He is our brother Daniel come home. When he milks you, you must be good and stand still. See how big and strong he is? He will take care of us and keep us safe. Suddenly he was afraid again. He looked away, trying to shut out the sight of her with her golden hair shining in the lamplight, trying to shut out a sound of that murmuring voice. Everything he cared about and worked for was threatened by that small, helpless creature. His arms and legs were cramped. The airless little house seemed to hold all the heat of the day. The sputtering oil in the lamp filled the room with a rancid odor. His head was heavy, and he thought with longing of the evening breeze that would be moving among the branches above the cave. With relief, he watched his grandmother lift down mats from a niche in the wall. I have made ready your old place on the roof, she said. He took the worn roll of matting, bade her good night, let himself out the door, and climbed a tottering ladder up the outside wall to the flat rooftop. It was little cooler up here. Heat lay over the town like a smothering blanket. He sat for a time, hugging his knees and looking about him. Why did I come here? He thought. Already he yearned to be away from this place. Hunger gnawed at him. Up on the mountain, the men would be still sitting about the fire, their stomachs satisfied with stolen mutton and grape wine, joking and telling boastful stories. Later they would wrap their cloaks about them and sleep with their lungs full of clean mountain air, and the stars would come down, brilliant, close enough to touch. He wondered if Joktan had made sure that Samson had enough to eat. He wondered how long the man had waited at the top of the trail. Suddenly he flung himself on his face and buried his head in his arms and could have wept for homesickness. All right, that's the end of chapter 3. What on earth are we? I keep getting dings. Let's see. Something, something, something. Here's. Okay, I've already seen that. It was me. I got it back. I'm not getting that. Circle of Doom. Oh, you got Circle of Doom. I'm sorry. All right. Um, so who wants me to go on with chapter 4? Let me see how long it is, first of all, because oh, it's not too bad. Let's do it. All right, chapter 4. Let's change to the right window so I can. All right, are you all ready? This is chapter 4. The Sabbath morning was very still. Not a grindstone rumbled, not a voice was upraised. No puff of smoke rose from the clay ovens. Oh, Rebecca's almost asleep. You want me to wait for tomorrow? It's less than 10 pages. Getting through. Kimberly, are you watching? Okay, so if we're not watching, then maybe I should stop for the day. Okay. Okay, go on. All right. No puff of smoke rose from the clay ovens. Go back to that window. Okay, good. No women passed on their way to the well. Descending the ladder to the house, Daniel found a handful of olives and a cold crust of bread waiting for his breakfast. The little goat wandered in the small garden patch behind the house. Very early in the day, when Daniel was already wondering how he could endure another hour, Simon came to the door. His knock sent Leah cowering into a corner. Daniel hastily went out into the road, shutting the door behind him. "I'm on my way to the synagogue," Simon said. "I'd like you to go with me." Daniel scowled. "I haven't been to a synagogue for 5 years," he countered. "One more Sabbath won't matter." "On the contrary," Simon answered with a smile. "Today is none too soon." Daniel's lips tightened. He bent and picked up a pebble and shied it at a little green lizard that had crawled from under the house. Simon's eyebrows lifted. Probably it was against the law to throw a stone on the Sabbath. "There's a man I'd like you to see," Simon told him. "They say he will visit our synagogue this morning." Daniel glanced up. Beneath the words there was a hint he could not miss. "What sort of man?" "I'm not sure," said Simon. "He comes from Nazareth." "Good reason to stay away," grumbled Daniel. Then, feeling the pressure of Simon's silence, "A zealot?" "It may well be." "Come and see what you make of him." "In these clothes?" "I have brought you a cloak and shoes." Daniel stared at his friend. If Simon, stickler for the law, had carried a bundle on the Sabbath just so that Daniel could see this man, he must consider the matter important. Daniel took the cloak and went inside the house. His grandmother was nodding again in the corner. She looked up and muttered his father's name, her eyes confused with sleep. Leah crept forward. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Leah crept forward shyly and bent to fasten the leather sandal. "Will you go with me?" he asked on impulse, and could have bitten his tongue at the terror that leapt into her blue eyes. "Never mind, I didn't mean it," he said miserably, jerking away from her. Simon looked him over with approval as he stepped out into the roadway. "How does it seem to be home?" he inquired. "You call this home?" Daniel burst out. "My grandmother does nothing but sleep, and my sister is possessed by demons." "She is no better. Before I was apprenticed, when she was 5 years old, she hid herself in that house. In all this time, she has never stepped outside the door." "So I've heard. The demons must have a strong hold. Yet she does good weaving, I understand. Your grandmother sells it in Shirazin." Daniel had not paid much attention to the loom in the corner, but now Simon's words somewhat lightened his shame. "Who is this man we go to see?" he asked, not wanting to think about Leah. "Jesus, son of Joseph, a carpenter by trade. He has left his work and goes about preaching from town to town." "Preaching? I thought you said he was a zealot." "He preaches the coming of the kingdom." "You have heard of him? Or you have heard him?" "No, but I have seen him. I journeyed to Nazareth with a friend who went to arrange for a wife. While we were there, this carpenter came back to preach in his own synagogue. A town like Nazareth must have boasted they did not boast. They tried to kill him. Almost like we read that just about 30 minutes ago. So anyway, I don't know." Daniel glanced quickly at his friend, his curiosity roused not so much by the words as by the tone of Simon's voice. But Simon had no time to say more. They were approaching the small stone and plaster building in the center of the village, and men and women brushed close to them on either side of the road. Daniel had to stoop to go through the low doorway. He sidled close to the wall, tensing his muscles, conscious of his shaggy height and his wide shoulders, trying to draw in and make himself smaller. But he soon realized that today there was no curiosity to spare for him. He was sure that the synagogue had never been so full in his childhood. Close together on the low benches huddled the men of the town, their knees drawn up almost to their chins. They sat in order of their trades, the skilled artisans nearest the pulpit, the silversmiths, the tailors, the sandal makers. Farther back sat the bakers, the cheesemakers, and the dyers, and all along the walls were Daniel and Simon. Where where Daniel and Simon had taken their places stood the lower tradesmen and the farmers. Still others crowded the doorway, and many he saw would have to stand outside in the road, by the rustle and murmur behind the grilled screen sorry, that separated the women's section. Many of the men had brought their wives with them. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. The great words of the Shema rolled through the synagogue. For a moment, Daniel was caught up by them, as he had been in his childhood. But as the long passage of the law was read aloud in Hebrew and then carefully translated into Aramaic, the language which the people spoke and understood, his attention began to wander. Though the throng of men sat respectfully, he could feel their restlessness also, and the anticipation that mounted moment by moment. They knew that by custom a visiting rabbi would be invited to come forward and read from the Torah. When the long awaited moment came, every man turned to watch the stranger who made his way to the platform. The man's figure was not in any way arresting. He was slight, with the knotted arms and shoulders of one who had done hard labor from childhood. He was not regal or commanding. He was dressed simply in a plain white pelisse that reached to his feet. His white head covering, drawn closely over his forehead and hanging to his shoulders, hid his profile. Yet when he turned and stood before the congregation, Daniel was startled. All at once, nothing in the room was distinct to him but this man's face, a thin face, strongly cut, a vital, radiant face lighted from within by a burning intensity of spirit. Yes, Daniel thought, his own spirit leaping up. This man is a fighter. He is one of us. Jesus received the scroll and stood unrolling it with reverence, as though he were seeking for some passage already determined in his own mind. Then he raised his eyes and spoke from memory. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. A shock ran through Daniel at the first words. A gentle voice, barely raised, it carried to every corner of the room, warm, vibrant, with a promise of unlimited power. It was as though only a fraction of that voice were being used, as though if the full force of it were unstopped, it would roll like thunder. Jesus closed the book and gave it back to the attendant. The waiting congregation seemed to surge forward and to hold its breath. Again, that voice made the blood leap in Daniel's veins. I say to you, the time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe. Now? Daniel leaned forward. Tell us what moment has come. Tell us what we are to do. Longing swelled unbearably in his throat, but Jesus went on speaking quietly. A rippling murmur passed across the crowd. Others, too, waited for the word that was not spoken. What had the man meant? He had said liberty for the oppressed. Why didn't he call them to arms against the oppressor? Repent, he said. Now, repent, as though that could rid them of the Romans. Disappointment and puzzled, Daniel leaned back. The fire that had leapt up in him died down. The man's voice had been like a trumpet call, yet where did the call lead? Had Simon understood? Daniel stayed close beside his friend as the crowd streamed from the synagogue at the close of the service. Is he a zealot or isn't he? He just demanded as soon as they had outdistanced the others. What do you think? Countered Simon. I couldn't tell. Why did they try to kill him in Nazareth? They said he blasphemed. Some of them said he had set himself up as God's anointed, a common carpenter's son. They were beside themselves. How did he get away? Simon slowed his steps. I'm not quite sure, he said, though I was there and saw it. I didn't know what it was all about, but you know how it is with a crowd. I ran in with them, and I'm ashamed to tell it. I had a stone in my hand, too. They dragged him up the hill to a cliff, and they meant to push him over. But just at the edge of the cliff, they fell back, and he stood there alone looking at them. I don't know how it was with them, but all at once I was ashamed, terribly ashamed, of the stone in my hand. Then he walked back down the hill, and not one of them touched him. Didn't he fight to defend himself? No, he was not angry. He was just not afraid. I've never seen anyone so completely not afraid. Strange. Daniel would have liked the story better if the man had fought back. He was vaguely disappointed, let down as he had been in the synagogue. He scuffed along the dusty road beside Simon. I can't make the man out, he said finally. What did he mean that the day is at hand? Simon walked on for a moment, his eyes on the ground. I don't know what he meant, he said slowly, but I intend to find out. At a crossroad, Simon left him. I will look in on you tomorrow, he said. Keep the cloak. It is an old one, but you may have some use from it. Daniel walked on through the noonday heat, lingering to peer furtively at the people who passed. Though he shrank from their curious glances, he was in no hurry to return to his grandmother's house. Without warning, the sound of a trumpet split the Sabbath calm. Instantly, the peace around him dissolved into terror. There was a frantic scramble to be out of the road. Ahead of Daniel, two women and a child darted senselessly to one side and then the other. The younger ran back to jerk her child after her, the older woman shrieking at them both. Barely was the way cleared when a detachment of Roman cavalry trotted by, the horses' hoofs sending up a choking cloud of dust. In their rear, four soldiers suddenly reined in, horses rearing, and stood guard. Some distance behind them marched a detachment of four soldiers. Paralyzed with hatred, Daniel watched them. This was not the same thing as looking down from the mountain. Here he could see them plainly. They were not even Romans, but Samaritan auxiliaries, traitors, paid to fight in Caesar's army. He watched their brutish faces pass, one after another, looking neither right nor left to smash those faces, even one of them. He bent and picked up a rock. Infidels, he shouted. A hand slapped down over his mouth. Another hand gripped his upraised arm and forced it back. He felt himself jerked flat against a wall, held fast, while two men stepped in front of him, between him and the marching soldiers. With the sharp pressure of their hands on him, Daniel's senses came back. He stood still, not trying to fight them off. He saw that they had acted so quickly that not a soldier had noticed. The detachment went on down the road, their laced boots slapping an unbroken rhythm. Gone, said a voice. And no trouble, praise God. No thanks to this one, another voice rasped. Abruptly, the hands released his jaw and wrist. Are you possessed? One man hissed. One of those hotheads, the other scoffed. Another came closer, peering into his face. Who are you, boy? Not one of ours, that's sure. Daniel looked back at them sullenly. I am Daniel Bar Yamin. Son of Yamin? Wasn't it your father who? Yes. Then you ought to know better. Do you want to bring the same curse down on all of us? I despise them, cried Daniel. I have taken an oath. Keep your oath to yourself, a man warned. You zealots cause nothing but trouble. You'll have every village in Galilee burned to the ground like Sepphoris. Daniel knew he had behaved like a fool, but he would never admit it. He jerked away from them and walked scornfully down the road to the narrow alley that led to his grandmother's house. At sundown, the thin, clear piping of the horn announced the end of Sabbath. Promptly, his grandmother snuffed out the Sabbath lamp, which had been burning ever since his arrival, and wrapped it carefully to put away for another week. The shadows settled closer around the one remaining flame in its saucer of smoking oil. With relief, Daniel perceived that it was time to take himself to the rooftop for another night. He was not sleepy. The long afternoon of inactivity had left his body restless. He was hungry despite the sacrifice of the two women who had barely touched the food. He sat on the rooftop and felt the village streaming and seething around him in the dark, like a great pot of stew. He hated the stifling, foul-smelling streets, the miserable house crowded close together. He hated this moldering house filled with the sighs of his grandmother and the murmuring voice of Leah. Here in the village, who cared about the dream of freedom? Even Simon was content to wait and talk, never to act. The man who had spoken, though, Jesus of Nazareth, there had been a moment when he first stood up to speak, when it had seemed, but it had come to nothing. More words, nothing but words. He knew one man who still dared to act. One of these days Rosh would show them all. One day Rosh's army would be strong enough, and then these timid men in the village would come scrambling to throw in their lot with him. And when that day came, he, Daniel Bar Yamin, would show them too. When the Romans were defeated and the last of them gone, he would come back. He would build a good house for his grandmother and Leah, and there would be plenty to eat and a good life for them at last. And there would be no more giving way on the road and looking over their shoulders before they dared to whisper, but everyone would walk free. In the darkness, Daniel climbed down the ladder. He caught the faint note of a bell as the little goat shifted in its sleep. For an instant he wavered. Would Leah be sorry when she woke and found him gone? Then he pushed back his doubts. Some day, very soon, he would come back and make it up to her. He walked through the narrow streets and struck off toward the hills. He walked swiftly, his feet sure on the rocky trail. Toward midnight he came to the foot of the steep ascent that led to the cave. His heart began to beat strongly and joyfully. As he started up the last climb, a dark shape moved out from the boulders above, loomed for an instant against the sky, and then came soundlessly down toward him. In the dim light, he could see the white gleaming arc that split the shadowy face. "Ho, Samson," he called back. He called out, "I've come back." And that's the end of chapter 4. And we'll begin chapter 5 tomorrow. The first word is the, or the, depending on how you say it. Usually in the beginning of a sentence, I think it's the. But maybe everybody has, let's see, what have we said? JJ watch it again tomorrow. I think that's a good idea. I think JJ would love this story. I think it's really great. Coffee at night. Yes, coffee at night. There you go. Right. Okay. So we'll do haha haha. Yeah. Yes. Army. Yes, army. Yes. Wow. Okay. So I hope that you enjoyed the story this evening. Um, wow, a lot happened. They went to go see that teacher at the synagogue. He seems kind of creepy, or I don't know, not maybe not creepy, but he, what's like I don't even understand what he's talking about. What's he talking about? It doesn't make sense. Okay, so anyway, something about repenting and kingdom of God and all that and everything. Wow. Okay. We don't have, well, we do have a fireplace, so I guess we can do that. So, all right. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah. All right. So, all right, you guys have a great evening. And we'll talk to you all later and have a good night. All right. God bless you guys. Goodbye.